Go put the bag down right now.
I am just loading my car. What is the problem, officer?
You're blocking the flow of traffic. I said put it down.
There is no traffic here. This is a designated parking.
Don't argue with me. Turn around and place your hands behind your back.
For a parking distance.
Stop resisting. You are being detained for failure to comply.
I am not resisting. You are making a serious procedural error.
The camera was already recording when the officer closed the distance. A parking area, a vehicle being unloaded, a brief exchange that, on its face, appeared routine. According to the footage, there was no raised voice, no visible threat, no emergency unfolding. And yet, within moments, metal cuffs were placed around the wrists of the woman standing beside her car. What the officer did not know at that moment, and what the camera would later make unavoidable, was that the person he had just handcuffed was a black chief judge. For years, she had presided over courtrooms where police conduct was examined, line by line. She had reviewed arrest reports, evaluated probable cause, ruled on suppression motions, and weighed whether officers had acted within constitutional boundaries. Court records show she had overseen cases involving unlawful detention, excessive force claims, and departmental policy failures. Her professional role had required her to scrutinize the very type of encounter now unfolding around her. None of that authority was visible in the frame. The camera captured only a woman standing in a parking space, loading her vehicle, as an officer asserted control over a minor dispute. According to the footage, the situation did not involve a traffic stop, a reported crime in progress, or an immediate safety concern. Yet the encounter escalated from conversation to detention with striking speed. This was the first moment of dramatic irony. The officer exercised physical authority over someone whose legal authority, exercised daily from the bench, extended to reviewing and restraining police power itself. The imbalance was temporary, but it was real, and it would not last. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the legal consequences of that decision were already taking shape, even if no one on scene recognized them yet. Every action captured by the camera would later be replayed, slowed down, transcribed, and evaluated not by emotion, but by law. The setting, a parking dispute, would become central. So would the absence of any clear justification for restraint. Public filings later confirmed that the incident would not end at the curbside. The city would eventually face a substantial financial penalty tied directly to what happened in those moments. According to official records, that amount would reach $900,000. At the time, however, none of that was visible. The officer stood where the law usually stands unquestioned. The judge stood restrained, silent, and momentarily stripped of the authority she had exercised for years inside a courtroom. The camera did not blink. It simply recorded the beginning of a case that would reverse the balance of power entirely. The footage shows the encounter beginning without urgency. A marked vehicle, a uniformed officer, a woman beside her car, handling personal items. According to the recording, she does not flee, she does not raise her voice, and she does not obstruct the officer's approach. There is no indication of a traffic violation in progress. There is no report of a crime tied to her vehicle. The setting is a parking area where her presence is lawful. From a legal standpoint, that baseline matters. At the moment the officer initiated contact, the woman was not subject to a stop based on observed criminal activity. The camera does not capture contraband, aggressive movement, or any behavior that would independently establish reasonable suspicion. What unfolds instead is a conversational encounter that quickly narrows into a command-driven interaction. This is where the legitimacy gap begins to form. The officer's questions, as captured on audio, assume authority over the space. Requests become directives. Directives become warnings. At no point does the footage reveal an explanation grounded in a specific statute or articulable safety concern. The woman's posture remains non-threatening. Her hands are visible. She continues loading her vehicle. Legally, that distinction is critical. Under Fourth Amendment standards, a consensual encounter does not become a detention unless a reasonable person would feel they are not free to leave. The moment authority is asserted without legal basis, the encounter shifts categories. The camera documents that shift in real time. As the interaction progresses, the officer's perception appears fixed on control rather than clarification. According to the footage, the woman attempts to explain her presence. She does not refuse identification in a hostile manner. She does not interfere with the officer's movement. There is no escalation from her side that would independently justify restraint. What the officer does not know, but what the legal record later confirms, is that the woman he is addressing is not merely compliant, she is acutely aware of how such encounters are supposed to be evaluated. Her professional life has required her to assess whether officers articulate lawful grounds before restricting liberty. In this moment, she does not assert that authority. She does not announce her position. She remains within the narrow role the situation has forced upon her. That restraint becomes part of the record. From the officer's perspective, the legitimacy gap widens. His actions proceed as though the encounter already carries enforcement authority. Commands are issued, physical proximity increases, the option to disengage remains available, but it is not taken. Each of these steps represents a decision point. None, on their own, would necessarily result in liability. Together, they begin to stack. The parking dispute itself remains unresolved on the footage. There is no clear evidence that the woman is blocking traffic, violating posted restrictions, or creating a hazard. The camera captures no attempt to verify ownership of the vehicle or authority to be present. Instead, the interaction centers on compliance with the officer's immediate commands. This is where constitutional analysis later focuses. Courts do not evaluate outcomes, they evaluate process. They ask whether the officer could articulate a lawful reason for transforming a brief interaction into a detention. The footage offers limited support for that transformation. As the officer's tone hardens, the woman's responses remain measured. She does not attempt to leave abruptly, she does not resist, she does not provoke. The legitimacy gap between what the officer believes he is authorized to do and what the law allows him to do continues to widen. The camera captures the moment when the encounter fully crosses the line. The woman is informed that she is being detained. There is no audible explanation tied to a specific offense. The justification, if any exists, is not stated on the recording. This is another chance to stop. He doesn't. From a legal perspective, detention without clear, reasonable suspicion becomes exposure. Each additional command, each physical adjustment, each second of restraint compounds that exposure. The woman's continued compliance removes any argument that force was necessary to gain control. Her legitimacy is not derived from her title. It is derived from the absence of unlawful behavior. Later filings would emphasize this point. The case would not hinge on who she was, but on what she did not do. She did not flee. She did not threaten. She did not obstruct. The footage documents those absences as clearly as it documents the officer's actions. As the interaction moves closer to physical restraint, the imbalance of power appears complete. The officer stands in uniform, supported by institutional authority. The woman stands alone, subjected to commands that the camera does not show to be legally grounded. What remains unseen but already inevitable is how this legitimacy gap will be examined. Every second of footage will later be reviewed, not by supervisors on scene, but by attorneys, investigators, and ultimately by a court. The question they will ask is simple. At what point did this stop being lawful? The answer will not favor the officer. The footage does not exist in isolation. Every action captured in the parking area occurred within a larger institutional framework, one shaped by training, departmental norms, and enforcement culture. Courts later reviewing the incident would not ask only what the officer did, but what systems allowed those decisions to unfold without interruption. According to public records, the officer involved was operating under standard departmental authority at the time of the encounter. There is no indication on the footage of a supervisor being consulted before the detention escalated. No radio call requesting clarification. No pause to verify whether enforcement action was necessary. The interaction proceeds as though unilateral control is both expected and unquestioned. This is where organizational context matters. Law enforcement training emphasizes command presence and scene control, particularly in ambiguous situations. But that emphasis carries risk. When control becomes the default objective rather than a tool justified by circumstances, decision-making narrows. Officers are conditioned to resolve uncertainty through authority, not inquiry. The footage reflects that pattern. Rather than stepping back to reassess the legality of continued detention, the officer doubles down on compliance. Each directive appears designed to reinforce dominance over the encounter, rather than to clarify its legal basis. From an institutional standpoint, this reflects a common enforcement posture. Maintain control first, justify later. Departments often rely on internal discretion to prevent escalation. Supervisors are expected to intervene when encounters drift from policy. Yet here, no such intervention appears. The officer operates alone, unchecked, and confident in the authority being exercised. This confidence is not necessarily personal, it is systemic. Publicly available departmental policies emphasize officer safety and compliance, but they also require articulable justification for detention and arrest. The gap between policy language and street-level execution becomes visible in moments like this. The footage shows commands issued without documented cause. That discrepancy becomes critical once the interaction leaves the street and enters review. Another decision point emerges here. The officer could have disengaged. The officer could have clarified the parking issue. The officer could have requested supervisory guidance. None of those paths were taken. Instead, the encounter continues along a single trajectory, one that increases legal exposure with each step. From a departmental perspective, this is where liability begins to shift. When officers act within clearly defined legal bounds, departments are shielded. When actions drift outside those bounds, institutional responsibility grows. The camera does not capture policy manuals or training slides. It captures behavior. And behavior is what courts evaluate. The officer's conduct reflects a broader enforcement mindset often criticized in post-incident reviews. The assumption that authority will not be challenged, and that consequences, if any, will be addressed later. In most encounters, that assumption goes untested. In this one, it does not. Because the person being detained is not an ordinary subject of enforcement, she is someone whose professional life has involved evaluating exactly this type of conduct. That fact, while unknown to the officer at the time, magnifies the institutional stakes. Once the encounter concludes, the department will be unable to frame this as an isolated misunderstanding. The footage will demand a systemic explanation. Why were decision points missed? Why was disengagement not considered? Why was restraint applied without clear justification? These questions will not be asked emotionally. They will be asked procedurally. As the incident progresses toward its most consequential moments, the department's role shifts from background to foreground. The officer's decisions no longer belong solely to him. They begin to implicate training, supervision, and policy enforcement at every level. The camera continues recording, the encounter continues escalating, and the space for institutional denial continues to shrink. The escalation does not arrive suddenly. It builds in small, deliberate increments, each one narrowing the officer's legal options. According to the footage, the officer closes the physical distance between himself and the woman. His stance shifts from conversational to controlling. The tone of his voice changes. What began as a disputed parking issue now carries the posture of enforcement. This is the next decision point. At this stage, the law still allows discretion. A brief inquiry could end the encounter. A warning could resolve it. Even disengagement remains available. None of those paths are taken. Instead, the officer asserts authority without clarifying the legal basis for doing so. The camera captures commands that assume compliance rather than seek understanding. From a constitutional perspective, this matters. Physical proximity combined with authoritative language is one of the markers courts use to determine when a reasonable person would no longer feel free to leave. The footage documents that threshold being crossed. The woman does not escalate in response. She does not make sudden movements. She does not raise her voice. Her body language remains controlled. She continues handling her belongings, signaling no intent to flee or interfere. The absence of resistance removes one of the most common justifications for physical restraint. Another chance to stop appears here. He doesn't. The officer's hand reaches for her arm. The camera angle shifts. Viewers later reviewing the footage would note the lack of urgency, the absence of any visible threat. This is not a takedown in response to danger. It is restraint imposed to enforce compliance. Handcuffs come next. The moment the cuffs are applied, the legal landscape changes. What was previously a disputed detention now approaches arrest-level restraint. Courts scrutinize that transition closely. The footage does not show an announcement of a specific charge. There is no explanation tied to a statute. The officer proceeds as though justification is implied by authority alone. That implication will not survive review. The parking area grows quieter. The surrounding activity slows. The woman's posture stiffens as the restraints tighten. She does not struggle. She does not argue. She stands still as the officer completes the action. This compliance becomes part of the evidentiary record. Here, the imbalance of power is complete. The officer controls the scene physically. The woman's authority, real but unseen, has no immediate effect. The camera records only the surface reality, a uniformed officer exercising force over a restrained individual in a public space. This is the final decision point before consequences become inevitable. By choosing to apply handcuffs without clearly articulated cause, the officer eliminates several defensive arguments. Claims of officer safety weaken without visible threat. Claims of investigatory detention strain under the weight of prolonged restraint. Claims of mistake lose credibility as the encounter escalates rather than de-escalates. The camera continues to run. There is no interruption. No supervisor arrives to reassess. No recalibration occurs. The scene settles into a tense stillness, one that will later be dissected frame by frame. This is where escalation gives way to exposure. What the officer does not yet know is that this footage will travel far beyond the parking lot. It will be reviewed in conference rooms, in legal filings, and in courtrooms. Each second of restraint will be measured against constitutional standards that do not bend for authority asserted without cause. The handcuffs remain on. The moment is sealed. And then, for the first time since the encounter began, everything slows. The footage does not cut away. There is no dramatic camera movement, no sudden confrontation. Instead, there's a pause, long enough for the scene to feel suspended. The officer stands close. The woman remains restrained. The ambient noise of the parking area fills the space where justification should have been. This is the moment when the encounter stops evolving and starts becoming evidence. Later reviews would focus on this segment of footage precisely because nothing happens. There is no resistance to explain the cuffs, no new information discovered to retroactively justify them. The camera captures a static scene in which authority has been exercised and then left to stand on its own. From an investigative standpoint, that stillness is damaging. According to official records, the footage was preserved in full. Investigators reviewed the encounter in sequence, mapping each decision against departmental policy and constitutional standards. The timeline mattered. So did the absence of articulated cause at critical moments. The review process followed a familiar progression. First, supervisory personnel examined the footage to determine whether policy violations were apparent. The lack of documented reasonable suspicion immediately narrowed the department's defensive posture. The officer's commands, tone, and use of restraints were evaluated not in isolation, but cumulatively. Then came internal affairs. At that stage, the question was no longer whether the encounter looked inappropriate, it was whether it could be defended. The answer depended almost entirely on what the camera showed, and what it did not. There was no visible threat, no attempt to flee, no obstruction, no discovery of an offense after the fact. The footage spoke plainly. This is where the authority reversal completes its turn. The woman in handcuffs is no longer a subject of enforcement, she becomes a complainant. The officer, once the unquestioned authority on scene, becomes the subject of scrutiny. His actions are replayed, paused, and compared against standards he is trained to enforce. There is a brief, telling moment captured near the end of the recording. The officer's posture shifts, his movements slow. The confidence that drove the escalation no longer dominates the frame. Nothing is said that alters the situation. The realization, if it exists, is internal. This is the mid-video silence. No analysis is offered, no justification is given. The camera records the quiet. The power dynamic has already changed. Once the footage entered formal review, the outcome was no longer controlled by the officer or the department alone. City attorneys became involved. Risk assessments were conducted. Exposure calculations replaced on-scene discretion. According to later filings, the strength of the video evidence constrained the city's options. The clarity of the recording reduced ambiguity. Each additional layer of review confirmed the same conclusion. The encounter could not be credibly defended as lawful. From there, the process moved out of internal channels and into the legal arena. Timelines were established, claims were evaluated, negotiations began under the weight of recorded fact rather than narrative explanation. The parking dispute was no longer relevant. The identity of the restrained individual, while significant, was not decisive. What mattered was that the footage documented restraint without justification, and did so from start to finish. By the time the investigation concluded, the outcome was largely predetermined. The camera had already done its work. Once the investigation moved beyond internal review, the city's exposure became quantifiable. What began as a parking dispute captured on camera had evolved into a civil liability issue with clear financial risk. According to official records, the footage left little room for alternative interpretation, and that reality shaped every legal decision that followed. The first consequence was administrative. The officer's conduct, as documented, failed to align with departmental policy governing detention and use of restraints. Supervisors reviewing the incident noted the absence of articulated reasonable suspicion and the premature escalation to handcuffing. That assessment alone was enough to trigger disciplinary action. The precise nature of the discipline was addressed through internal channels, but the finding itself established a formal record of wrongdoing. From there, the matter entered the civil system. City attorneys reviewed the footage with an eye toward litigation. Their task was not to assess morality, but defensibility. In civil rights cases, especially those involving unlawful detention, video evidence is decisive. It either introduces ambiguity or eliminates it. In this case, it did the latter. Legal analysis focused on the moment the encounter crossed from consensual to custodial. Without a clear, articulable basis for detention, the officer's actions exposed the city to claims under federal civil rights statutes. The application of handcuffs in a non-threatening, non-criminal context significantly increased potential damages. Settlement discussions followed. According to public filings, the city ultimately agreed to a payout totaling $900,000. That figure reflected not only the strength of the plaintiff's case, but the cost of proceeding to trial in the face of unambiguous footage. Jurors tend to trust what they can see. Here, what they would have seen was restraint without cause. The financial impact did not exist in isolation. The settlement amount drew scrutiny from city leadership and the public. Budgetary consequences were immediate. Funds allocated to address the claim came from municipal resources, tying the officer's on-scene decisions directly to taxpayer expense. This is where the authority reversal reached its final legal form. The chief judge, once restrained in a parking area, now stood as the prevailing party in a civil action. The officer, whose authority had gone unchecked in the moment, became the source of institutional liability. The city, tasked with defending its employees, was forced to concede. The timeline mattered. The speed with which the settlement was reached underscored the evidentiary strength of the case. Prolonged litigation would have amplified costs and public exposure without improving the city's position. Resolution became the rational choice. Official statements following the payout emphasized compliance with the law and a commitment to review procedures. They did not dispute the footage. They did not challenge the legal conclusions drawn from it. The record spoke for itself. By the time the case concluded, the encounter had moved far beyond the individual officer. It had become a data point in broader discussions about enforcement, oversight, and accountability. The $900,000 figure attached a concrete cost to decisions made in seconds. The law had spoken, not through rhetoric, but through evidence and consequence. The case did not end with the settlement. While the $900,000 payout closed the civil claim, it opened a broader institutional reckoning. When incidents are resolved with clear video evidence and substantial financial consequence, they rarely remain confined to the individuals directly involved. According to official statements, the department initiated reviews of its training protocols following the resolution. Encounters involving low-level disputes and non-criminal contexts received renewed attention. Emphasis was placed on distinguishing consensual contact from detention and on articulating lawful justification before escalating authority. These measures were presented as corrective, not punitive. The city's role also shifted. Budget officials and oversight bodies examined how a routine enforcement action had translated into a significant taxpayer expense. Settlements of this magnitude are not absorbed quietly. They are logged, reported, and compared against prior cases. Patterns emerge, and those patterns inform policy. For the judiciary, the incident carried its own weight. The fact that the restrained individual was a chief judge did not alter the legal analysis, but it sharpened institutional awareness. Courts rely on the assumption that constitutional boundaries will be respected in practice. When footage shows otherwise, the credibility of enforcement suffers. What ultimately drove reform was not outrage, but clarity. The camera had captured a sequence of decisions that could not be reframed. There were no missing angles, no disputed moments. The record was complete. That completeness made denial impossible and reform necessary. In the aftermath, the encounter became part of training discussions, internal audits, and legal briefings, not because of who the subject was, but because of what the footage revealed. Authority, when exercised without legal grounding, produces measurable harm. That harm can be tracked through policy revisions, litigation costs, and public trust. The officer returned to anonymity. The parking area returned to normal use. But the footage remained. It remained as a reference point, a documented example of how quickly routine encounters can collapse into liability, how seconds of escalation can produce years of institutional consequence, and how cameras, once activated, shift the balance of power permanently. No speeches were required. No interpretations were necessary. The footage made it undeniable.